On 22nd September 2020, Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia, Guy Debelle, delivered a paper called The Australian Economy and Monetary Policy. The Deputy Governor noted that the various monetary policy actions by the RBA have led to a significant increase in the size of the RBA's balance sheet from 170 billion in February, which we calculate at 8.5% of Australian GDP, to 300 billion now, which we calculate as 15% of GDP. The two major causes of the increase in the size of the RBA balance sheets have been two forms of quantitative easing. The first is as a direct consequence of the bank's purchase of government bonds. When the Reserve Bank buys bonds in the secondary market, it directly boosts the banking system's deposits. The second is that there has been an increase in the Reserve Bank's balance sheet by funds provided under the Term Funding Facility, or TFF. This has substantially increased liquidity. These funds are lent by the RBA to the banking system for a term of 3 years at a fixed rate of 25 basis points. The TFF in Australia sits within the category of quantitative easing, which in other countries has been called funding for lending. What is the impact on the take-up by the banking system of the TFF? The TFF has lowered lending rates by lowering bank funding costs. The TFF funding is considerably cheaper than wholesale funding of a similar maturity. Secondly, the TFF is having a notable effect on the composition of bank funding. One result has been a reduction in offshore funding, which is a very similar size to the take-up of the TFF. The amount of domestic wholesale funding has changed little. However, banks have chosen to let their offshore funding roll off as it matures and instead gain their funding from the TFF. We note that the premium or the spread between US investment-grade debt and US sovereign debt is currently around 260 basis points. This spread adds to the cost of funds being offered to Australian banks. Given that this spread is added to the domestic cost of funds, we can see that being able to access money from the TFF at only 25 basis points makes this a much, much better deal than borrowing money offshore in the US wholesale market. Australian banks would be wrong not to take up the money from the TFF instead of raising money ashore in the US wholesale market. How long will quantitative easing continue? Quantitative easing is new in Australia, so we tend to think of it as a short-term action that won't be sustained for very long. Experiences in other countries, though, have been very different. Let's look at the US. The Federal Reserve began its first experiments in quantitative easing in November 2008. Back then, US unemployment stood at 6.8%. Quantitative easing didn't stop unemployment from rising in the US. In fact, US unemployment peaked about a year later in October 2009 at 10%. From that time on, however, continued quantitative easing allowed the economy to recover. US unemployment fell gradually to September 2014, at which time the Fed brought to an end quantitative easing. The difference between the beginning of quantitative easing during this period and the end was fully 5 years and 10 months. In the US, quantitative easing was not a short-term strategy, but it was in practice a long-term strategy. How did the Fed decide when the time had come to end quantitative easing? Let's look at some of the indicators. Firstly, by September 2014, unemployment had fallen to a number with a 5 in it. The number for US unemployment in September 2014 was 5.9%. Perhaps more importantly, though, inflation, which had fallen as low as 0.9% in October 2009, had risen by September 2014 to 1.7% on the core personal consumption deflator. This core PCE deflator of 1.7% was very close to the Fed's target for inflation of 2%. In his presentation, the Deputy Governor noted that the 3-year target for Australian 3-year bonds is aligned with the board's guidance about the future direction of the cash rate. The RBA will keep buying bonds as long as it wants the cash rate to stay at the current level. The board has stated consistently that it will not increase the cash rate until progress is made towards full employment, and it is confident that inflation can be sustained between the 2 to 3% target band. Now, the RBA expects that unemployment will rise to 10% by the end of 2020 and gradually decline to be 7% by the end of 2022. He notes that there'll still be a further decline in unemployment needed before the Australian labour market would be nearing full employment. He says that prior to the pandemic, the unemployment rate was about 5%, but even this low level was not low enough to generate sufficient wages growth consistent with achieving the inflation target. Under the current scenario, it would be more than 3 years before sufficient progress is made towards full employment to be confident that inflation would be sustainable within the target band. Therefore, he notes it's highly unlikely that the cash rate will be raised any time within the next 3 years. How high can the RBA's balance sheet go? International comparisons tell us that the increase in the size of the RBA balance sheet could have a long way to run. The website of the US Federal Reserve tells us that as of August 12, the total size of the balance sheet of the Fed was $6.967 trillion US dollars. This was 34% of US GDP. The Bank of America suggests that the size of the Fed balance sheet will rise to 48% of US GDP by year end. In comparison, the size of the RBA balance sheet was 8.5% of GDP in February and has risen to 15% of GDP now. This means that the current size of the RBA balance sheet is less than half the size of the US Federal Reserve relative to GDP. In Australia, quantitative easing is something new. It's natural to think that it won't be maintained for long. The experience in other countries, however, reveals something different. When the Federal Reserve began quantitative easing in November 2008, it did not end that quantitative easing until almost 6 years later in September 2014. Guy Debelle in his presentation appears to suggest that quantitative easing will continue for as long as the cash rate remains at its current low level. He doesn't believe that the current low level of the cash rate will be moved unemployment is at 5% or lower. In his presentation, he says that he doesn't expect that unemployment will be 7% until the end of 2022. On this scenario, it will be beyond 2023 and into 2024 before we have the opportunity to start increases in the cash rate that bring an end to our program of quantitative easing. In conclusion, quantitative easing in Australia has two major components. The first is that the RBA will continue to buy Australian government 3-year bonds. The second is that the RBA will continue to expand the term funding facility to provide funding for lending for Australian banks. Neither of these programs looks like they'll be coming to an end before 2024 at the earliest. Quantitative easing is now a long-term strategy of the Reserve Bank of Australia.